Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Is the microphone on or not? I can't tell. Now can you hear me? Yes. Well, let me. Is that too loud? Yes. No? Yes, it's too loud. No, it's not too loud. I wonder if we can get a midway. I'll just whisper then. Thank you all for coming out this midday. I'm Tom O'Grady. I work here at the History Center and part-time at the university for 40 years, I think, talking about the sky. Anyway, this is our Lyceum speaker series at lunchtime, brown bags. Somebody called me the other day and said they wanted to reserve lunch for 2, so I got to do better at promoting this thing. I hope all of you are members. That's probably how you know about this thing, because you got to notice an email or something like that. But if you're not a member of the Southeast Ohio History Center, please become one. Help us increase the voice for historic preservation and saving and sharing the amazing stories of Southeast Ohio. I'd say Southeast Ohio history is American history, and in some cases, it's world history. And we're not doing a very good job of letting ourselves know about that, let alone other people. Anyway, restrooms are back here in the corner in case somebody needs to do that. And we have a couple other speakers lined up for the next months coming up next month. And I don't know the date. Sorry. You getting feedback? I don't know the date, but we're trying to aim for the third Thursday of the month, but sometimes we have to be flexible with the speakers. Speaking of speakers, we're still trying to work out the speaker system here. Anyway, doesn't sound good. Next month, we have Dan Robotham from the Madog Center in Rio Grande, the Welsh Studies Institute over there. He's going to talk about the Welsh heritage and the Welsh history of Southeast Ohio, where we know where they came from, these Welsh, but what did they do here? How did they help build this region and build Ohio in the Midwest? And then the following month, we have Keith Milam from Ohio University Department of Geological Sciences, and he's going to be talking about the geology surrounding the Serpent Mound. It's been known a number of things as the Serpent Mound volcanic disturbance site, or the meteor site. So the Ohio Department of Natural Resources studied it for $300,000 like 30 years ago to define what is this volcanic or is an impact, and they now call it a Serpent Mound geological disturbance. That's not very courageous. After $300,000, they didn't choose to define what it was, but it's an impact site. And he's going to tell us about that. And then the following month, we have Pat Anderson. She's going to talk about Indian trails in our region. Anyway, thanks for coming out. I'm glad to see that total eclipses of the sun are popular. So, this is a big deal. There has not been one of these in Ohio since 1806. And the next one's 2099. So, it's important to catch this one if you can. Something like this happening in ancient history was a big deal. Now it's just something you hear about on the news, and there's going to be a lot of people that don't make any effort to see this, but they don't know what they're missing. For ancient peoples, so many cultures around the world, the sun and the moon were their number one deities. This was important, so if your number one deity, the sun, the giver of life and light and warmth and all the things that make things grow, disappears in the daytime, that's significant stuff, and they want to know about that. And so they've always looked to the sky. Humans seem like they've always looked to the sky for answers to the great questions they've had, and if you look at the sky enough, there's a lot of stuff going on up there. It's harder to see nowadays. Most of us live in cities, and you look up and see wires and lights and everything else. But the night sky has been inspiring. It's inspired art and architecture and music and literature and everything. Connected to everything. So something like an eclipse is pretty phenomenal stuff. Comets, man, and these things were seen as omens. So when we look at human history, some of the furthest back we can see that here we have an eagle bone, 30,000 years BC, with the phases of the moon carved into it. Here we have a cave in southern France, 17,000 years ago, with the phases of the moon worked out in it. This is a tomb in Ireland. I forget, it's something like 6,000 or 7,000 years old, and the sun shines in this window here on the winter solstice at sunrise, and it goes down this long corridor with some of the biggest rocks you've ever seen, and the floor gently rises till you get to this sacred room in the back end at sunrise, and that's when you can see it. Stonehenge is built in alignment with an 18.6-year cycle of the moon, and this 18.6-year cycle of the moon is the cycle that we need to know if we want to begin to try and calculate when the sun and the moon are going to cross paths in the sky. And so when people started talking about that, a lot of people thought, well, we need to debunk that notion, and they basically, by doing all the research, have gone on to verify that for whatever reason they built these ancient things, they still took and I guess if you were going to move rocks that big and carry them as far as you did, you'd probably think a lot about exactly where you wanted to set each one. And so it doesn't surprise me now that I think about it that they would have aligned these things with as much detail as they do. And so I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson verify that, you know, Stonehenge is an ancient Stone Age computer capable of predicting eclipses of the sun and the moon. And in Egypt, it's not a, you know, look, they got the sun and the moon on their heads. Here's two folks who've been sitting around for thousands of years with the sun and the moon on their heads. You know this stuff's important to these people. And this is a symbol I saw repeatedly when I went over to see an eclipse over there. And I think that this is a depiction of an eclipse. And they have it a lot. And in Egypt, over a period, this was a depiction of an eclipse out west in 1879 at Pikes Peak. Trying to describe the outer atmosphere of the sun, which is only visible when every aspect, every bit of the surface of the sun is hidden. If 1% of the sun is shining, it's still daytime, you can't see that, but it's always there. And one of the interesting things about this, scientists have found out that this is hotter than the surface of the sun. They don't know why. I like that. So here's some information about an eclipse, 1143 BCE. It's carved into the earth included. Look at all the eclipses they had crossing the Nile Valley between 3000 and 1000 BC. And they had the sun god Ra and all that. So you know this stuff was important to these folks. Here in Ohio, we have the biggest geometric earthwork in the world up at Newark, Ohio. This giant circle and octagon. It's big enough to have an 18-hole golf course in it. And it's built in alignment with that 18.6-year cycle of the moon. And nobody knows exactly why they built this thing, but it is capable of being used. It does serve also as an observatory. It seems like a lot of work just to figure out an observatory. And think how long they had to observe the rising and setting points of the moon over an 18.6, and how many times they had to do that and pass that on, as far as we know, by word of mouth, because there's no evidence that the mound builders had any written language. They didn't use the wheel. It's amazing the work they did, but it is built in alignment to these amazing rising and setting points of the moon, not the sun. And I mean, just one wall is maybe 20 feet wide, 8 to 10 feet high, and 500 feet long. Think how many baskets of soil that is. Think how many baskets that is to weave. I mean, we see these things and we don't really put a lot of thought into exactly what all got it there and how many times did they have to watch the moon rise and moon set to know exactly when you get all these people to weave these baskets and move this earth exactly where you want them to put it. Pretty amazing stuff. Same with Serpent Mound. It's built in alignment with the 18.6-year cycle of the moon. Stuff on this bluff, and that bluff is there because of the meteor impact site 250 to 300 million years ago. But they have found that a line right here through this part points at the solar solstice sunset, a line from the coiled tail through the mouth or the whatever this part is points due north, and then at these loops you can look, and that's where the sun rises on the solstices and equinoxes. Well, they figured that out in the 90s, 1990s. Well, they kept going back, and now they find all the other bends in the body are built in alignment with that 18.6-year cycle. And that's the key thing you need to know to come up with where eclipses are going to be and when they're going to happen. Here we have an old clay tablet from 1375 years BC talking about an eclipse in May, on May 3rd. Maybe somebody figured out how to read that. Amazing. So anyway, you know, moving all these rocks and all this earth, part of this, for whatever reason they did, if it was ceremonial or if it was whatever reason, part of it was making calendars and timekeeping, because they needed to know about when you're hunter-gatherers and you don't have, you know, the 6 o'clock news to let you know what's coming up next. They needed to know when animals were migrating, when things were needed to be planted or harvested or what have you. So we have so much to learn about ancient people. So this is just going to be a real quick basic about how eclipses happen. You got the Earth going around the sun in its orbit, and then you got the moon going around the Earth. The Earth goes around the sun on a plane with all the other planets. The moon goes around the Earth on a plane, but it's not exactly the same plane. If it was exactly the same plane, we would have an eclipse every month. A solar eclipse every month at new moon and a lunar eclipse every month at full moon. But it's tilted by 5 degrees, just 5 degrees. So the moon goes through the same constellations of the zodiac as the other planets and as the sun appears to as we go around it. But because that, you know, these things are all casting shadows because of the sun, and so the shadow of the moon at new moon typically goes below the Earth or above the Earth every month. But if those two planes happen to be crossing at the same time as new moon, then the shadow is going to hit the Earth. And what's the chances of that? Well, about 1 out of 30. Astronomical, so to speak. But, so there is an eclipse of the sun somewhere on the Earth about every 18 months. But to get it in a certain spot, it's a little more unique. There's a couple other things. So normally this is what happens, is the shadows miss each other. Just slightly, but they miss each other. So for a partial eclipse, it can be that the sun and the moon and the Earth both have two shadows, an umbra and a penumbra. And the umbra is the one that causes the eclipses that we mostly see. If you're in the wider shadow, you get a partial eclipse. If you're in this shadow, you get a total eclipse. But here's a case where that shadow is missing the Earth, but the other one's partly hitting it, so you can get a partial eclipse in some areas. Something like that. And here's another little ditty. The moon doesn't go around the Earth in a circle, it goes around in an ellipse, so sometimes it's closer, sometimes it's further, and it can vary up to about 25,000 miles every month. Well, if it's closer, it's going to appear bigger, and that means it'll cover the sun longer, it'll make a bigger shadow, and it'll last longer. And if it's further away, it might not even be big enough to cover the sun. So it can be significantly different. You aren't going to see it. People are talking a lot about these days about supermoons. And they'll say, oh yeah, I saw the moon last night. Wasn't it so big? You know, we can't tell the difference. That's the power of suggestion. You heard it was going to be a supermoon, so you look at it and it's way bigger than you ever saw it before. But it always looks the same to the human eye. But when you line it up with the sun, you can see that slight difference. Now here's a situation where the moon, and it's going around the sun or the Earth, and it's further away from the Earth. That umbral shadow won't reach the Earth. But it will continue and make a little crisscross here, and it'll create another path, what we call the path of the umbra, or the anti-umbra here. And if you're on that path, you get what's called an annular eclipse of the sun. And annular, we think of annual or yearly, but no, annular comes from the word annulus, which means ring. And what happens is the moon's not big enough to block out the entire sun, so it sits in front of it. You can only see this with filters. It'll be daytime. You'd never know that this was happening. Even this photograph was taken through filters. You just can't look at even 1% of the sun. Not 1%. And then this is what we're going to have this time, is where the umbra actually hits the Earth, and as the Earth spins, that path will go thousands of miles. And depending on whether the moon's closer or further from the Earth determines how wide that path is. So if it was just at exactly the distance where it's just big enough to cover the sun for a few moments, the path won't be that wide. It might be a couple miles wide, but if the moon is closer, it might be 100 miles wide, kind of like it is this time. And then you get to see this, the outer atmosphere of the sun. And it's always different. So here's an image of the moon's shadow from space moving across the Earth. This is the path of the moon's shadow on April 8th. Starts out in the Pacific, comes up across Mexico, through the Midwest, going over Niagara Falls. Think how much they're charging for hotels at Niagara Falls. And up over Maine and out into the Atlantic Ocean there. Another image of the moon's shadow on the cloud tops of the Earth. So in ancient times, people didn't know what was going on. You heard about eclipses in 3rd grade, and even if you didn't understand it, you at least knew somebody was explaining it to you, so there was an explanation. These people didn't know that. So when it gets dark, that was scary business. They didn't hear about it the day before or anything like that. And so they came up with all kinds of superstitions about what's happening, like there's some dragon swallowing the sun or something of that sort. And they would start beating on hollow logs or drums, starting fires, shooting arrows at the dragon to chase it away. And inevitably, they were always successful. So you might as well keep doing it. There's a story in ancient Egypt about the emperors. They always wanted somebody watching the sky. And there were these two brothers, Hi and Ho. They were the star watchers. And they were also interested in alcohol. And at one point, apparently, they were more interested in the alcohol than keeping an eye on the sky. And there was a total eclipse of the sun, and they had not warned the emperor. And they lost their heads over this. This is serious business once upon a time. Imagine somebody losing their head over that today, in a real way. That's scary stuff. But anyway, 2137 BC, you can Google it. I stumbled in someone looking up some of this stuff about eclipses. I found a pattern of eclipses being associated with issues of war and peace, so I thought I'd throw a little something in on that. So in the area of the world that's Turkey to us today, it was lived in by the Lydians and the Medes, and of course they were fighting over some of that space, which we tend to like to do as human beings. And this is back in 585 BC, and right while they're out in the heat of battle, slaughtering each other, the moon moves in front of the sun, darkens the sky. Nobody told anybody this was happening, so both sides saw it as a bad omen and withdrew to their respective sides, and then they sued for peace, and they married the daughter of one tribe to the son of the other, and they got along for a while until they decided they needed to fight again, because we fight no matter what, don't we? We have never ever solved these issues. So anyway, here's a story of Christopher Columbus. He came to the New World, new to him, old to the people, been here a long time, several times, and I think it was on his 3rd trip. His boat was not seaworthy to go back to Spain, so he had to lay over in Jamaica, and he was running out of provisions. It took 2, 3, 4 months to cross the sea in those days. And so, running out of provisions, he sent for the leader of the local tribes and said they needed some supplies and some help. And they said, well, no. You know, when you guys came ashore, we treated you like royalty, but, you act like you own the place. And so, no, we're not going to help you out. And so he's thinking about this a day or two, and he remembers there's an upcoming eclipse. Because one thing he was a great navigator. And to be a great navigator, you got to know the sky. And so he came up with a ruse, and he said, go get those guys again. I need to talk to them again. And he says, look, I know you guys have lots of gods in your culture and your society, but we just have one, but he's the one true God, and he's all powerful. And if you don't help us out here, he's going to remove the moon from your night sky. Oh, yeah, sure. Well, when the moon moves into the Earth's shadow, because they didn't hear about it on the 6 o'clock news or anywhere else down the block, they're quick to show up with some provisions, and then he says, well, I told you. He says, now, and of course I'm paraphrasing here. I don't know that nobody recorded this with a cassette or anything. Cassettes? Come on. He says, now he's got to cover him. So he says, now, I told you could do this. Now, he's also not just all powerful, but he's all merciful. So let me go back into my cabin and have a few words with him and see if we can't get your moon to come back. And he's in there peeking out the clouds, out the curtains, long enough to say, okay, well, just don't let this happen again. Anyway, you can Google these things. This is a story of a guy who was teaching at Harvard. His name Samuel Williams, and he'd been up to Newfoundland a few years earlier when Venus went across the face of the sun. And Edmund Halley had said some years earlier, after they invented clocks that could be synchronized and they had telescopes, he said, if you measure, if people go to the far corners of this round globe and measure the exact moment that the Venus hits the edge of the sun, the exact moment it gets inside the sun, the exact moment it hits the other side of the limb of the sun, and the exact moment it gets the outside. If everybody goes to these different places and gets those times with the same kind of a clock and shares that information, we can then calculate the distance to the sun. Edmund Halley said that. And so they did it. They went to Siberia, and they went to Cape Hope, and everywhere in the world. It's amazing how far they went. And they shared this information, and that's the first time they knew that Venus was closer to the sun than the Earth, and that Earth was closer than other places, but they didn't know what any distances were. And they knew it was several thousands of miles at least. Well, when they did this, they realized, wow, the sun is millions, maybe tens of millions of miles away. So it threw it into a whole new magnitude of distance. And so they did this back in 1639 and 1761 and 1769, because Venus does this, and then it does it 8 years later, and then it does it 120 years later, and then 8 years later, and 120 years later, and 8 years later. And so people sailed to the far corners of the earth like 5 or 6 times trying to figure this stuff out. They always got better at it. The last time was 2004 and 2012, so it's going to be a while before it happens again. But we already have that figured out. But anyway, he'd already done that kind of thing. Now he's calculated the path of totality of the eclipse going to go across Maine and Penobscot Bay. And he wants to go up and check out this thing. And what's going on in 1780? American Revolution. Well, the British held Maine and Penobscot Bay at the time, and so he can't just go up there. So he got John Hancock, the Speaker of the House, to pen a letter to the leader of the British forces to ask for safe passage for him to get up there to observe this, because his argument was, even in the midst of war, they may come up with information and stuff that has benefits for all of humanity. So the British forces gave him permission to get up there on the bay. He hauled all this equipment up there, and the guy gave him a very strict places he couldn't go. Well, he gets up there and sets up, and it doesn't get dark out. Of course, he claims the guys who made the maps that he used to get there made errors. The map maker said, no, you miscalculated the path of totality, and somebody else said it's the leader of the British force. They wouldn't let him get to the right spot. But anyway, it's not one of the banner days in Harvard history. But it's an amazing thing that this happened, and some guy said it's remarkable to learn that even in the midst of armed struggle, scientific advancement was considered by both sides important enough to take priority over the more ephemeral concerns of politics and military supremacy. Even as the course of history is being decided on the battlefields, this history of ideas and knowledge continued to unfold, only occasionally being hindered by mundane events. Then, that was 1780. Not too long later, 1806, we'd already had the Battle of Fallen Timbers up northwest Ohio, and the Treaty of Greenville. Native Americans were segregated to the northwest part of Ohio, but William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, and included some of Ohio, was constantly isolating some of these tribal leaders and getting them to cough up some land. And Tecumseh didn't want to lose any more land, so he's working on putting together a confederation of native tribes so that they can have a big enough confederation to stop the loss of native lands. And he got that from the Iroquois, who then introduced that idea to Benjamin Franklin, who got the United States, the 13 colonies, to work together to resist England. And so that wasn't lost on Tecumseh. He's going to get together a confederation of tribes himself, and he's going to stop this stuff. And this, of course, is, and he's got a brother, a younger brother, who had injured himself when he was young, had a bad eye, and got into drinking a lot. But at some point, he had a vision, just like a year before this, and his vision indicated he should quit drinking and give up all these Western things and go back to native stuff. And he picked a new name. He was known as Lele Litika, which meant noisemaker, and he picked the name Tenskwatawa, open door, or the prophet. And he was working with his brother on this, and William Henry Harrison was threatened by all this business, and so he sent a letter to the leaders of these tribes saying, the prophet, he's no prophet. If he is, ask him to have the sun stand still, or the moon to alter its course, or the rivers to cease their flow, or some of this kind of stuff. That's a big challenge. And Tecumseh and his brother get together and they think about this, and it's thought. Nobody knows the details on this, but if you Google the 1806 eclipse, it's known as Tecumseh's eclipse because, and it's thought that he figured it out when he was on the road learning or putting together his Confederation of Tribes. He met so many people. He learned to read English and the Bible and stuff. He probably learned about this, and so they came up with this ruse. He said, the prophet did, 50 days from this day there will be no cloud in the sky, yet when the sun has reached its highest point, at that moment the Great Spirit will take it into her hand and hide it from us. The darkness of night will thereupon cover us, and the stars will shine round about us. The birds will roost, and the night creatures will awaken and stir. So Harrison's idea backfired on him. And of course, this happens. And then Tecumseh, of course, orders the Great Spirit to let it go, let it come back. But anyway, yeah, think about the stuff in the frontier. There's another part of a problem with this particular story. It is thought that Tecumseh and the prophet were at Greenville, Ohio. Well, Greenville, so you see this path comes right across the United States and across the Ohio country. I want to talk about this path again on another eclipse. But Greenville is just outside the path. Here's the center line. So you had to be at least inside the green line. There's another green line up here. So if they didn't see it themselves, they certainly heard from plenty of people who did. So apparently they gained the street cred they needed for a while after that occurred. But you can Google that eclipse, Tecumseh's eclipse. In 1831, Nat Turner, who'd been brought up in bondage in the southern states, he was one of the few people who was taught to read and write and thought himself a bit of a charismatic preacher and stuff. Well, he had a vision or a dream or something that told him he was supposed to rise up against his oppressors. And so he would have a sign. And the sign was an eclipse in August of 1831. And so they rose up. He had his gang of fellows together, and they struck back, and they killed a bunch of people, which only brought a reign of terror back down on him and everybody he knew. A sad thing. But it's another one of these issues of war and peace. During the Great War, so Germany starts the war in Europe, and of course Germany, they want to get all their big scientists involved to help them win the war. Well, they wanted Einstein to help, and Einstein said, well, no, I don't agree with what you're doing, and I'm a pacifist. I can't help you out on that business. I won't help. And he had already just come out with his theory of relativity, so he's a pretty famous guy, and he refused to support it. His boss at the University of Berlin resigned his job and joined the effort to develop mustard gas. Just think what Einstein could have done. Anyway, and then in England, they have the head of their scientific community, Arthur Eddington. He's the Royal Astronomer and head of the Royal Society. And of course, the British want him to help out. And he said, I was raised Quaker, I'm pacifist, I can't help you, I don't believe in violence, and no, can't do it. And of course, they're beside themselves. They want to put him up for treason and being a traitor and lock him up. And Cooler's head said, now wait a minute, that's not going to be good for popular morale in our society if you do that. And let's think about this for a minute. So what Eddington proposed, that he would like to go on an expedition to the island of Principe off the coast of Africa and observe a total eclipse of the sun, because he thought he could get the evidence. Let's get back to Einstein a minute. When he came up with his theory of relativity, there was a couple of ways to prove it. One of the ways was to prove it was during a total eclipse of the sun. And so Eddington said, well, let me go down there and get the evidence so we can prove Einstein's theory of relativity. And these people are listening to him going, we're at war with Germany. He's German. Why would we ever want to prove his theory of relativity? And he says, because it may have positive benefits for all of humanity. And so people thought this was a better alternative than locking him up. So he heads to the island of Principe. And meanwhile, this guy from Ohio, William Wallace Campbell from Findlay, Ohio, he grew up there. He went to Michigan, got educated, and then he was running Lick Observatory, the biggest telescope in the world. And he had already tried to go to these eclipses. He went to one in, is it on here? He went to one in Ukraine, and he went to one in Washington State, because what he wanted to do was prove that Einstein's theory was wrong. This is Ohio guy. So anyway, here's Einstein and Eddington when they're young. Anyway, so this could only be tested during a total eclipse of the sun. And Einstein was so rigid about this. He said, look, what he was saying was that the mass of the sun is so great that it will warp the space around it. And so light, as it goes past the sun, will be deflected or curved. Shortest distance in space between 2 points is not a straight line, it's a curved line, is what he was saying. And so he said a star that should be here would be here, but he gave a very, very narrow range of deflection. He says, if it doesn't fit into this narrow range, then my idea is a bunch of bunk. He was very strict with himself. And so here was the path of totality that year, and it was in 1919, the war had ended, but they didn't know that when they agreed to let him go. And it takes a lot of planning to get to the island of Principe and haul all the equipment that he hauled. And there was other people who were setting up over here in Sobral, Mexico for the same eclipse. Here's a gathering that brought out the townspeople. When you show up with a bunch of equipment, everybody out in the middle of nowhere looking up at the sky, people want to see what's going on, so the crowd show up. And look at the equipment they were hauling. I don't have any images of what Eddington hauled down to the island of Principe, but you can imagine to try and get these images, he had a lot of stuff. So it'll take some planning to get there. And he was trying to get images of the stars next to the sun during totality, and he would have taken photographs to show the deflection of the starlight. And here's Eddington over in Brazil, super crystal clear skies. Eddington's on this island of Principe, clouds, clouds, clouds. You know, and his reputation's at stake on this thing. And so at some point there was a little bit of openings in the clouds. He got the images that he needed, showing that the stars were deflected a little bit, calculated it all out. He was 100% sure that it fell within Einstein's range of possibilities. And when he got it back, nobody would accept that because cloudy, fuzzy pictures, his reputation was on the line. They put a lot into this. They were not going to just accept it because he said he had the data. And so the skepticism remained. And then this guy from Ohio, he tried twice to prove Einstein was wrong in Ukraine and in Washington State. So now there's another eclipse in 1922 in Australia. And he's going to go, and he's going to get the evidence and prove Einstein and Eddington are both wrong. And so he goes over there, Western Australia. This was no small feat. You know, people are going to fly into Ohio, get off and go get a few beers and go watch an eclipse. Look what these people had to do. They had to wave this stuff ashore, get mule teams to haul it out to the site that they're going to watch, because they wanted to go out to the center line of the path of totality and build all this infrastructure. Heavy equipment here. There's Campbell working on his mirror. There's his wife. He brought his wife. So anyway, they got the evidence. Here's the dark room to develop the images they got. So in, and I didn't mention in Sobral, Brazil, they got a lot of images, and it was so sunny it ruined all their photographic plates. They really didn't have the evidence. So it was really Eddington was the only one that came back. This is the image they got in Australia, but this is Campbell's description of the displacement of the stars, and what he ended up doing was proving that Eddington and Einstein were both correct. And like a good scientist, he accepts the facts. You have to let go of the things you wish or want or hope for and say, you go with the facts, not the alternative facts. So anyway, he went on to do a lot of great things, and they've got a crater on the moon named after this guy, and a crater on Mars named after this guy. You probably didn't know that. In Ohio, one of the 2 craters out there in space. Here's Eddington and Einstein a few years later. You can go back up a little bit. Here's a fellow named Benjamin Banneker, a self-taught astronomer. He was born in Maryland. I believe he was not born into slavery. Anyway, he was self-taught, and in 1789, he successfully calculated the path of an eclipse a couple years hence. And even though it contradicted the path that was predicted by other people who had more credibility and experience, and he turned out to be correct. Here's some of his drawings of that particular thing. And he sent this booklet. He made an almanac, and he sent a copy of it to Thomas Jefferson in 1791. And he was challenging Jefferson because of his, by his slaveholder's sincerity as a friend of liberty. Challenging. Jefferson wasn't president yet. I think he was still Secretary of State. So anyway, Jefferson writes back. Here's his letter back to him, just like a week later. And he says in it, I thank you sincerely for your letter of the 17th instant and for the almanac that it contained. Nobody wishes more sincerely than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is owing mostly or merely to the degraded condition of their existence, both in Africa and in America. So here's this guy getting Jefferson to acknowledge that, these people have levels of equality that he wasn't willing to, fight enough for. So anyway, I'm back to Tecumseh's eclipse. That was in 1791. Oh, and I should say this eclipse in 1791, I'm going to mention it again. The eclipse was 1806. I showed you the path came across the United States and went over Ohio, but also went over New York. This guy here had come from Spain, Joaquin Ferrer, a Spanish astronomer. He traveled to New York to see it. So you can tell people already knew how to calculate these paths. They knew how to, so it's likely that Tecumseh had found that out from somebody like this or somebody else. But this guy, when he saw it, he remarked about the outer atmosphere of the sun that was visible and called it a corona. And that name has stuck. It's one of the few names in science that has a Spanish background instead of Greek or Latin or English or something like that. But anyway, that was the same eclipse. And then this fella here, John Quincy Adams, born the very same year as Tecumseh. He happened to take a class from that guy Samuel Williams, the one that went up to Maine and Penobscot Bay. And since he miscalculated it, he made all of his students calculate the paths of totality. So when Adams was in his class, he had to calculate several of these eclipses. And the first one he ever observed was the one in 1791 that Benjamin Banneker plotted out. And he went up on a hill in Boston to see that. And he didn't protect his eyes, and he hurt his eyes looking at it. It was an annular eclipse where the moon didn't completely cover the sun, and he thought he could look at this. And it hurt his eyes. It didn't blind him, but he suffered from that injury for the rest of his life. But he happened to be, he saw more eclipses than anybody I know of without actually going to see eclipses. He just happened to be in places. So this is the eclipse of 1806. He says, I returned this morning to Boston this morning on the Quincy stage. I soon after went to Mr. Busey's, in whose garden the gentlemen of the Philosophical Society met to take observation of the solar eclipse. It commenced at 8 minutes, 21 seconds past 10 in the morning. At 11:22:38, this is a detailed guy. He's kind of like Jefferson, who gets up every morning and he takes down the moment the sun rises, what's in the sky, and the temperature. Every evening does all this. So it's not just 11:22, it's 11:22:38. Total obscurity commenced at 11:27:09. The first ray of the sun blazed out from behind the moon, and at 12:48.1 the eclipse ended. The total obscuration continued for more than 4 minutes and a half. The sky during the whole time was unusually clear, and not a speck of cloud was visible on the horizon. At the commencement of the eclipse, the thermometer in the shade stood at 68. It fell gradually until the end of the total obscurity when it stood at 57. There it remained stationary. You can tell he's having so much fun. There it remained stationary about a quarter of an hour and then began to rise until at the end of the eclipse it was at 67, and a few minutes after at 70. The fading of the sun's light from its greatest splendor until its total extinction was peculiar, differing much from that of the usual declining day on the approach of evening. 6 or 8 stars were visible during a considerable part of the time. The planet Venus appeared particularly large and as bright in the darkness as it usually does in the evening. Mr. Busey entertained us with a cold collation. And between the first reappearance of the sun and the end of the eclipse, I dined with Sheriff Allen and company. This guy, when he does this stuff in his journals, he doesn't miss a beat. He goes right into the politics. And I found out this guy, he saw a lot of eclipses. This happened to be one he saw in 1817, and there was a comet in the sky at the time. He was the greatest proponent of astronomy in his era. He was the Carl Sagan of his era some years before Satan was born. During the first State of the Union address, he called for the establishment of a national observatory. He had already sent $1,000 to Harvard. This guy never had any money because he was always taking care of his brother's failed businesses and his kids' failed operations. But he still thought of astronomy. When he was in Europe, he had served as the ambassador to a number of countries. He'd already been a U.S. senator. He'd been Secretary of State. He'd been President of the United States. But when he was Secretary of State, he sent $1,000 to Harvard to get started, because he said when he was in Europe, he had seen upwards of 130 of these lighthouses of the skies, and in North America, not one. So he wanted to get them built. He was ultimately in on the establishment of the U.S. Naval Observatory, the Harvard Observatory, the Cincinnati Observatory. He came to Ohio in canal boat and stagecoach to do that when he was 76 years old, in nearly a wilderness, and the Smithsonian Astrophysical Institute. He recorded at least a dozen solar eclipses that I was able to pick out of his handwritten diaries. And there they are. You see them in Cambridge, Boston, Russia, England, Washington, D.C., places like that. Not because he traveled to there, but he was tuned into this stuff. Here's an eclipse out in 1878 out in Colorado. In this crowd here is this fellow right here from Ohio. That would be Thomas Alva Edison, and he went out there because he invented a tasometer. You guys know it. You all have a tasometer, don't you? Tasometer is to measure the slight change in temperature during the total eclipse. That same eclipse was pursued by the women of Vassar under Maria Mitchell here. She took a bunch of women out there to observe this eclipse. It's amazing. As well as the trains were running in those days, they lost these women's luggage. But anyway, they managed to get it together, and there they all lined up on the center line of the path of totality outside of Denver in 1878, watching that eclipse. This is one that occurred in 1900 down in Wadesboro, North Carolina. This is a bunch of British astronomers who came. This is a group that includes a fellow from Tupper's Plains. This guy here is from Tupper's Plains. You guys know where that is, right? And this is George Ellery Hale. He raised the money to build the biggest telescope in the world time after time after time. And he hired this guy from Tupper's Plains to do the optics on it. So anyway, he went to that same eclipse in North Carolina. More on another day on these guys. Here's a bunch of Russians up in Uzbekistan in 1907. Quite a bit of luggage. Now here's something that I thought was interesting. The Los Angeles is a blimp, or a dirigible, an airship. And so for the eclipse of 1925, they wanted to go up and see the eclipse aboard this thing. So this is the crew of scientists who went up on board this dirigible there. It's cold. It's in January of 1925. There they are taking a picture out the window, and then there's this guy, the aeronautics chief photographer during the expedition, climbs onto the observation basket to shoot the eclipse. That would probably be considered liability stuff today. We got President Calvin Coolidge and his wife watching the eclipse from the White House with a little filter. You can see they're holding something up. Of course, everybody remembers this eclipse. No protection. Partial eclipse, those are partials. Just a few pictures of people looking at eclipses. This is Paris, 1911. Berlin, 1914, couple of cops. Los Angeles, 1923. Some nurses, 1927 in England. New York, 1932. Philadelphia, 1932. Now this is interesting. This gets into our area, 1960s. Now, this is a partial eclipse, and you're not allowed to look at a partial eclipse, right? Because if 1% is shining, you can't look at that. And so she's explaining how to do this experiment, and they're going to be in the penumbral shadow of the moon, so she's going to have them design these boxes with a hole in it. And so here they are. And what impressed me the most about this is the sharp instruments that these people use. Look at this girl with this big dagger. Whoa. Anyway, they each cut up their little box. They could stick their head in their box, and then they had a pinhole in it, and the light would shine through, and it would project an image of the partially eclipsed sun. It was very safe. And so here they are. This looks a little militaristic. But anyway, it's a little out of control. But see, they all have a little hole in there to let the light in. What's easier to do is go stand beneath a tree and let the light shine through, and there's a million crescent suns on the ground. But we'll talk about that. Anyway, I just thought I couldn't not share that. So this is what they're looking for, these crescent suns. Here there's no box involved, just a tree. Crescent sun. So you want to be watching, if you don't head up north to see this eclipse, this will all happen down here. You get the partial eclipse down here. It affects wildlife, birds, cows go back to the barn to be milked. It could be 10 o'clock in the morning. But things change, and the animals are sensitive to the change in light, so they'll do what they need to do. Nocturnal animals will emerge. This is this is just a percent. This is called the diamond ring effect. And it happens just the moment before totality and the moment after. You can't really look at it. You can see it and glance away. People take photos of it, but you can't look at it. This is one where the moon is just barely big enough to block the sun. And so this is the sun shining through the mountaintops on the limb of the moon. I predict that the lighthouses at Marblehead and Fairport Harbor will come on when it gets dark out. Somebody needs to go up there and check on that for me. Here's a total eclipse of the sun. Here's the planet Mercury, visible. The outer atmosphere of the sun, the corona. This is a phenomenon that occurs if you're on the path of totality. It's called shadow bands. I've seen, I think, 8 eclipses, 7 or 8. I've seen this once. And apparently you can't photograph it because they're these wavy, you can't say they're lines. You can't see the lines, but you can sense this stuff happening. So it's depicted there. First one George. Is George here, by the way? George Everett, you guys all know George, right? He convinced me to go look at one of these back in 1979. And we traveled down to Colombia, South America. We spent 4 days on a bus like this, going to this eclipse. And the roads were phenomenal because they cut all the trees off the hills, and the erosion was phenomenal. A lot of times the hills would slip. And so they kept parking bulldozers right along the side of the hill because when the road disappeared, they'd bulldoze a new one. And they played a lot of loud salsa music and had a lot of religious stuff. And I realized why when I looked out the window and saw how far down it was to the tree. It was a good distraction. But we finally made it out to the path of totality. And it was cloudy. It was out on the plains, out of the mountains there. And this is Pierre. He's from Quebec. He said he was Quebecois. And he came ashore like Columbus and planted his flag. He'd been to 3 previous eclipses and was clouded out. Look at that sky. So we got out there and we had to ride out in the back of a dump truck because there's no buses going out the middle of the prairie. And we ran through some rain, and there were these 2 rainbows off, really as far off into the horizon as you could see. And, again, like you get a bunch of people setting up stuff and looking at the sky, it draws on-watchers. And it drew out the local minstrels who serenaded the crowd. But somebody had the foresight to bring some mylar so that they didn't leave a little blind village behind. And during totality, this was 29 seconds. That's a long way to go for a 29-second eclipse. I didn't know. And then a cloud moved right in front of the whole thing, so we didn't get to see it. But we saw the shadow coming across the plains. We watched those rainbows go off. There was a sunset 360 degrees around you. You got goose pimples all over, and your hair stood up in the back of your neck. And everybody in that crowd was hooting and hollering. I think that's a primal utterance that comes out of people. They want to chase the dragon away. And then everybody gets very silent. And then it's over. 29 seconds. This is where the clouds opened up just a little bit, and there was a crescent sun there. It was broad daylight when I took the picture. Cameras were more sensitive to the light, to the absence of light than I was, because I would have never thought that it looked like a picture in the darkness at a bright spot, but it was daylight when I was taking the picture. So even if 1% of the sun is shining, how many of you stayed in Athens 2017 for the eclipse? Okay, so it was about 97, 98% covered here, but it's daytime. A 99% partial eclipse is 100% different from a total eclipse. So if you think you're close, you're not getting it. All right, then it inspired me. So even though I was clouded out on that one a couple years later, I don't know what I was thinking. Went up into Manitoba, Canada in February. whoa. But went up there and we headed for Riverton, Manitoba, and it was snowing there, but they had this amazing ice festival going on, all these giant ice sculptures, and we wanted to check it out, but we were out for an eclipse, so we kept heading along the path of totality, and the next morning, we're driving along, we have a welder's lens looking up, you could see a little bite was taken out of the sun. And I'll tell you, Manitoba's the flattest place on the planet. The glacier just, and there's not much up there, so we decided once we saw that little bite to turn down the first side road. And these side roads are straight, and they go for a million miles. So we turned down this road, we're going down this road, there's a car parked, and this guy's got a telescope. Who'd have thunk? So we parked next to him, of course, and we were there for totality. We weren't too far from a barn, and the cows showed up just before totality. The birds went to roost, we saw all that, and the temperature dropped from 8 degrees to 0 degrees. Somebody thought about that, and even out of this small group, there was hooting and hollering during totality until it got quiet. And you know, there's always a little round of applause afterwards. I don't know where that comes from. 1991, George and I went down to San Blas, Mexico. They said it was 89% chance of cloudy skies at Teotihuacan, where the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon were, so we thought, let's go for the 79% chance of clear skies on the coast. The village of San Blas, a fishing village, named after Saint Blaise. He's the patron saint, so that you pray to him so you don't choke on bones. Good name for a fishing village. Anyway, we got there a couple days early, checked it out, and then this was a 7.5 minute eclipse. That's the longest an eclipse can last, 7.5 minutes. But it clouded up. We got to see about 1 minute in a clear sky, and then a cloud moved in front of it. But still, it's more than just seeing it. It's an entire experience. Went down to Venezuela in '98 to see one. What a cool little town this was. They had a really cool cultural thing that they were doing. This was the week of Festival, just before Lent starts, right? So every day in this town, maybe in the whole country, they close the schools and the businesses at noon and have a parade. Eclipse Total, Delamore would love that year, was the theme. You can see the floats coming up the street. Kids were dressed like Sputniks and things. And then when the parade was over, they closed the street off and drank and danced till dawn. Did it again the next day. Wonder why we don't do that. Anyway, here's a float coming up the block, the sun and the moon. But that town, everybody in town knew about this eclipse. There were artists out on the street painting pictures of a little church with the eclipse up above. But they were right next to the path of totality. They were not going to see it, and they didn't seem to get it. There's a little peninsula that sticks up like a finger up into the Caribbean. And even that, you had to be up on the top of the peninsula, because it was really going across the islands of Aruba and Curacao out in the middle of the Mediterranean. I couldn't get out here. So we went up, and you had to ride in the back of another dump truck to get there. And then, you know when you're getting close, there's signs along the way. Like, and there's sketchy individuals. People with, you're out in the middle of nowhere, and there's people with metal briefcases. Of course, not everybody was out for the eclipse. Now, George was trying to explain to people during the partial phases about how you can see these crescent suns if we had trees. There were no trees on this peninsula. And this was back in my era when I was doing in the solid waste business and recycling and waste reduction and stuff. And I wasn't expecting, when you head down to the Caribbean, the Blue Carib, you're not expecting to deal with work. So the high tide every day brings in all this plastic. The entire length of the shore, and then it buries it and brings in another load the next day. So out of this pile of stuff, George managed to find an old tennis shoe and a piece of plastic, and these little islets here, he managed to project a little row. You can't see them, but there's 4 crescent suns right there. What he wasn't able to get across in his broken Spanish, all of a sudden it crystallized, and everybody got it, and a little round of applause. And then we got the totality, and I took that picture. There's a reason they make tripods, because that's a handheld photo, and the moon didn't look like a football. This is Mercury and Venus. They weren't dancing, but they looked like it in that picture. Then there was the eclipse of 2006. This went from from Brazil to Africa, almost like Einstein's eclipse, but that one went this way. Anyway, George and I headed over to there, so we never thought we'd get to see the pyramids in our lifetime, but we made the eclipse our reason. And so we went to the pyramids. Do you know the pyramids close at 4 o'clock in the afternoon? Who'd have thunk? Closed? What do you mean they're closed? You have to go. Then they like to have light shows and stuff at night, and it's kind of amazing. And they're fixing the Sphinx. I was wanting to see the ruin, but it's going to be new soon. But anyway, we checked a lot of stuff out, but the path of totality was over by the Libyan border. It was actually the center line was in Libya, but Muammar Gaddafi was still running the show there, and you couldn't go into Libya. So we go to the border, and it's the only time George and I ever went to see an eclipse where as soon as you got off a plane, they kind of funnel you onto a tour. I remember the day they took us out to the pyramids, we were there for 40 minutes. And then we had to get on the bus and go back. So the next day we were sick. We went to the pyramids, spent the whole day there. But they took the tour buses up to this place on the Libyan plateau. I swear it was a landfill. I wasn't expecting it. But there were hundreds of buses up there. All these people from all over the world were funneled up onto the Libyan plateau to see this eclipse. So we got away from that and wandered off into the desert there a little bit and found this little place. And still couldn't get away from all the trash. But out of this mess, George managed to find another piece of foot gear. There were all the buses, man. I think there was over 100 buses. But anyway, they found an old army boot here, and he was able to project a little row of crescent sun. And then moments before totality. So this is not quite totally yet, but this robin, there were no animals out there, but this robin came and roosted right next to us. Then there was totality. You can see the sunset that went in every direction around. This is the planet Venus. It was darker than that. I don't know how to make cameras capture what you're seeing. But this was interesting because then there was this rumbling sound that you could hear in every direction. We didn't know what that was. We found out later. And some of the people over there during a total eclipse, they get out their prayer cloths and they pray out loud. And so there was this loud rumbling sound across the land. It was different. Again, I took a picture with a camera and tripods. They do a better job. And I happened to see that over there and just wanted to share it with everybody. It's the most garlic I ever saw in one spot. Just saying. So here's an annular eclipse. So here's the sun and the moon setting. In the afternoon, the sun is setting in the afternoon. The moon is there too. Usually we don't see it, but this particular case is going across the face of the sun. So you can see over a period of a couple of hours as the sun is setting, the moon went in front of it and it lines up perfectly. So there was there was an annular eclipse of the sun here in Ohio in 1994 in May. Here in Athens, it was about 97%. Does anybody remember that in 94? Yeah, so George and I went up to the lake, and you know that first eclipse we went to, traveled 4 days through the Andes Mountains. We got there an hour before totality. This one we're headed to Lake Erie. We got 3 minutes before annularity. But we got up there, and the crescent suns were beneath this big cottonwood tree. And the closer it gets to being lined up, the longer and more slender they get, until the moon gets right in front of the sun. And then they turned into overlapping ringlets. So these are images of the sun with the moon in front of it. You see that? Pretty amazing. And we decided to go to Crane Creek State Park to get away from the crowds of people and let's go do a nature thing with the sun and the moon. There were thousands of people up there because it was migratory bird season. They all had optical equipment, and so we thought, wow, they'll want to see this. They were resistant to this like nobody's business. They man, this thing, look at it. So here we are looking through our little welder's lenses. There's the crescent ringlets on the ground there. And then people are just going to watch the birds. I mean, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event happening, and they were not going to look. They were resistant to that. But anyway, you want to get your eclipse glasses. These are for partial eclipses. Take them off during totality. But you can also use a welder's lens. It's the same price, like a couple bucks. And I think it makes actually a better image. Get them at the welder supply store, you can get them online, you got time. You can stand under a tree and hold your hands out. You don't need to get a box out and poke a hole in it. But if you were going to do this with kids, I would say have them get a box and 2 sharp pencils and have them poke 100 holes. Because they'll never forget that. And then when they stand in there, they're not looking at one crescent sun, they're looking at 100 of them. Or you can get a colander out. There's a million different things you can do to project the crescent suns. You can just crisscross your fingers and get crescent suns. Hold your hand up like that. I've noticed, the marketing's coming on. The media has found out about this eclipse, so you can get chips, you can get t-shirts, you can get, and all the way from Texas to Ohio, you can get hats, and you can, like, there's one, this is being made specifically for this historic eclipse. Look at this, solar eclipse party guide in Cleveland, where to be. You don't want to miss. So they've had to change the time of the baseball game in Cleveland for this. You know that. They were scheduled to be playing when, you know, you can't be playing ball when everybody's looking up in the sky. So they bumped the starting time of their game till sometime after the eclipse. Anyway, you want to catch all these things. So, you want to be focused on the corona. This one here. Not this one here. Or this one. Had enough of that one. But this is the corona. If you haven't seen, how many of you have seen the corona of the sun? All right. Well, one. Is that all just one? Well, for 30 years I got asked that question and no hands went up, so at least one went up out of this crowd. Next time I ask that question, half the people are going to raise their hands. So anyway, you're out to see the corona and all the other stuff. What I've noticed is every eclipse expedition is both a cultural expedition and a geographical expedition. So, by all means, go discover a part of Ohio you haven't been to and see this event. This is, of course, a long time exposure, giving you more detail of the corona. So here's your path of totality. There's, you know, for years astronomers have been plotting this thing, but now somebody told me that if you go online looking for an Airbnb, they're blocked out all the way across the entire United States, so the path of totality can be depicted with no vacancies. So here it is coming in western Ohio. The center line is up above Greenville and going right over Cleveland. There's actually going to be people in Cleveland who don't leave their computer screen for 3 minutes to go out and see this. That's almost as amazing of a phenomenon as the eclipse itself. But anyway, it's going to catch part of Columbus, part of Cincinnati, parts of Toledo, all of Cleveland's going over Buffalo. That Nocturnus beer, that's from up around the Buffalo area. These are all the paths of totality, so they're not uncommon, it's uncommon that they come to you. These are all the paths of totality between 1979, which is up until a few years ago, was the last one that was in North America, came in Oregon area and went across. That's the Manitoba one that I went to. Then 2017 was the one that came through a few years ago. This is an interesting one here, the annular eclipse, 1984. So George and I went over to Assateague Island to see what's an annular eclipse going to be like. And it was pouring rain. So we went down to Chincoteague thinking it'd be sunny down there, like 20 minutes away or something. Anyway, it was pouring rain. So we wandered out on the peninsula. It was May 30th, Memorial Day weekend. We're a little discouraged. We're standing out there surrounded by all this lush green vegetation, and we knew what time it was going to happen, and then it got dark out. We weren't expecting that. It doesn't get dark during annular eclipses. We watched the swans go to roost out on the bay, watch these big white herons roost in the tops of trees. You ever see a great white heron land on the top of a tree? Honestly, it looks like they never tried before. And you swear they're going to just fall all the way down, and they never did. But anyway, and then the lighthouse on Chincoteague Island came on. You could hear people hooting and hollering up on the island, just for a bit. And it turns out this is, and I didn't learn it for 20 years or something, but they have such a thing as a hybrid eclipse. And it's really complex geometry, but along long stretches of the path, it's an annular eclipse, but things work out just perfectly for a total eclipse along portions of it, and then it turns back into an annular. And we didn't know that, but we happened to luck out for that one. That was pretty amazing. These are some of the other ones, 91, and that was the one in Mexico we went to, in 98 in Venezuela. Cool. I thought this was interesting. Over here, the island of New Guinea here, they had an eclipse on 11 of June 1983, comes across the island right here, and then November of 84, again, and there's one spot on that island that had 2 total eclipses in something like 15 months. That's impressive. So you see a lot of places where they cross, but if you look, that's 2008 and that's 1990. So there's big differences. They had 2 in a year right on that one spot. So, and they now, since they know what this is all about, they can plug this, they can tell you what every path of totality was back as far as you want to go, or as far into the future as you want to go. So they've got maps like this for the future. You can plan your vacations around the moon's shadow. So here's 2099. This one comes through Athens, Ohio. 2099. Put it on your calendar. But there's lots of eclipses. You can go online, and these are just the ones in the United States. Maybe you always wanted to go to New Zealand, find out when the eclipse is there. It's still 2 versions on the sun. So there's lots of them. The red ones are annulars, the blue ones are totals. Anyway, that's it. That's all I have to say about eclipses. Anybody have any questions? Anybody have any answers? Yes, sir.
The width of that path that is going diagonally through the state, if you're inside the outside path of each side, you're in the total.
Yes.
Okay.
The further you are from the center line, the shorter it's going to last, though.
I got you.
On the center line in Ohio, it's going to be around 4 minutes, a little, give or take a few seconds. The closer you get to the edges of that, it'll get down. You might get 20 seconds. So if you're going to go all the way. Yes.
Where are you going?
Geneva, up on the lake.
Okay.
Oh, not Switzerland, no. Geneva, Ohio. My sister rented a space up there about 11 months ago. I told her about it, and she still didn't get in under any cheap deals. They've known it's coming for a while. They're charging, think what they're charging at Niagara Falls. And there's people can afford that. There's one guy I saw somewhere. He saw the eclipse in 2017. He's from Cleveland. He runs a restaurant. He said it changed everything about his business, so he spent the last 5 years or whatever it is redoing the roof of his building, and he's got it completely booked. People are going to be dining and drinking on his rooftop during totality. I hope it don't rain on him. That's the problem with Ohio. Mm-hmm. That's the problem with Ohio. It could be cloudy. But I don't know. There's a lot of places. There's a lot of people going to see this. It's going to change the concept of an eclipse for a lot of people in Ohio. Other questions?
Cloudy.
Will there be any planets?
What's that?
Will there be any planets in the sky?
It depends on if it's clear. If it's clear, Venus and Venus and Mercury will definitely be visible if one of them isn't in front of or behind the sun. Let's see, I think they're both off to one side of the sun or another. So yeah, if it's clear, they should be visible. I believe Jupiter should be kind of low in the eastern sky. It'll be rising about that time of afternoon. It's up prominent at sunset right now, but at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it might be just rising in the east. So probably some. It's worth looking at. You might see some bright stars. It's worth looking. Other questions? Yeah.
On the space station, what do they say?
I don't know. That's a good question. I had not even thought of that. But I thought of this, because you guys remember when they went to the moon back in 1969 to 73 or 4, whatever it was. And I assumed that, wow, 20 years from now, we'll all be able to go for a ride. Didn't you guys think that? I did. And I thought I would save up and then plan to go at a time when, how did I have this, where when you went up into space, the Earth was going to be eclipsing the sun. I was going to want to go in that direction. So I could see the Earth eclipse the sun. And so the sun would be between the Earth and you. Or no, the Earth would be between you and the sun. And with an atmosphere, it would do a lot of interesting things with the Earth's atmosphere. I don't know. But I thought I would plan that. But goodness, it's been over 50 years since anybody's been up that way. So I don't know, the space station, that's a good question. They might be able to create eclipses from where they're at. They might be able to, because I've seen these pseudo-eclipse images that when they get up in space, they can create a disk that blocks out the sun, and they can study the sun from the space station. So I think they can artificially create eclipses. They're not the same, I'm sure. Anybody else? Yes?
I'd like to thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Oh.
That's more information than I ever knew.
I'm sorry if I overwhelmed you. Thank you very much. Couldn't help myself. So you gotta be aware when you come to one of my talks. Yes.
Well, you said Tecumseh had probably found out about the eclipse. Someone had told him what day it expected. Well, so after the octagon was built and the Hopewell civilization kind of died out, people forgot how it worked?
Apparently, I would say, yeah. I would say that Native Americans at the time of settlement were still tuned in to their level of connection with the stars, but I've never seen a whole lot discussed about that. But, you know, they still probably kept time by the phases of the moon, but the 18.6 year cycle of the moon, they may have lost tabs with that. Yeah.
Now, how did Tecumseh go about, I've read in a number of places, predicting, well, not exactly the date, but he said it was coming, the Natchez earthquake?
Yeah, it was going to stomp and cause some earthquake or something, yeah.
It did
I don't
happen.
know. But yeah, there was an earthquake and it followed him saying something about it. Well, I don't know. You know, think about the history of that era. Who wrote it down? Who recorded this stuff? You know, this is the 250th anniversary of Lord Dunmore's War. Anybody ever heard of that?
Yeah.
We've all kind of heard of it. It was in our history books if you're in Ohio. Lord Dunmore marched right up this Hocking River Valley with about 1,500 soldiers. He camped over where Chansey is today. And when he got up to up around Circleville, they had a treaty with the Shawnee, and Chief Logan made a big speech there called Logan's Lament. And it said that at one time in American history, every school child committed that to memory. I believe that was in the one-room schoolhouse era when you learned something and you got into second grade, you had to teach the first graders what you learned. And you do that each year when you graduate from 8th grade. You could be the teacher. And but who wrote that down? Like when Logan's standing underneath that big elm tree giving that speech, like who had the tape recorder? Who had the shorthand? So you're asking questions about details back in that. You know, I've read some of Alan Eckert's stuff, and he's got conversations going on between Tecumseh and other people. You know, that's artistic license, I think, in some of that historic novels and things. So I don't know where that kind of information comes from. I don't. Just like if Tecumseh knew about this eclipse, how come? Was he on the path of totality, or was he just like that other guy, Williamson, just off of it and missed it completely? And heard from his buddies, yeah, it's pretty good you called that. He said, did it really happen? Because it didn't get dark where I was. So, I don't know. Those are good questions about how is that history recorded at that time. I don't know. It's worth looking into. Anyway, this is the 250th anniversary of that big event. When they got back down to where the Hocking flows into the Ohio, these fellas in this army were so feeling so good about themselves that they passed 2 resolutions. One of them is considered the first American Declaration of Independence. And it was, I don't know how long it took to get back to the East Coast on foot, but it was printed up in the Virginia Gazette, and Thomas Jefferson would have read it. This was 18 months before he wrote his declaration. And it was read on the floor of Parliament in March of 1775. Guy came here and told us that's going viral in the wilderness, to go from the banks of the Hocking River on foot to the coast and across the sea where it took 2 to 3 months and then read it in the floor of Parliament. Pretty amazing. And how many of us know this story? First American Declaration of Independence come out of the Hocking Valley. If we don't know that, maybe we should. So anyway, be watching for a talk on Lord Dunmore and the Fort Gower Resolves coming up one of these days. Can't help it. Anybody else? Any questions? Yes?
When you say 18.6 cycle of the moon, you mean 18.6 years?
The 18.6 year cycle of the moon. So the moon goes through a cycle every month, going through its phases. But the sun follows a complete cycle every single year. It rises at its southernmost point on the eastern horizon on the winter solstice, and its northernmost point on the eastern horizon. It rises there on the summer solstice, and it gets back to those two things every 6 months. So it follows it exactly. The moon does it slightly different, and it finally gets to the northernmost point where it rises, and then it's the extreme northern and its minimum northern points. Those are 2 points, and there's an extreme southern and a minimum southern point where it rises. There's 4 different key points where it rises, and it rises at each of those points once every 18.6 years and sets the same way in the west. Think how long they had to be watching the moon to determine that and share that down to generation, so that when they did start deciding to move Earth and stuff to line it up with that, you had to have it down. You couldn't say, oh man, we got that big old long line of dirt. It's wrong. Move it again.
Well, it seems like to actually observe that, you'd have to make some semi-permanent structures.
They probably did start setting sticks or something up, and that's not uncommon that they would put sticks in places or rocks, but to make the big commitment to get the whole society involved, and how long would it take to do that? How many have been to Newark? It's now a World Heritage Site. There's a number of implications about that, because there's no evidence they used the wheel or had any written language, and there's no evidence that they had money. None of that stuff shows up in their artifacts. And it kind of implies that they were going through a long period of peace, because it would have been hard to be being militaristic and defending yourself while you're doing all this other work. And then there had to be all the people who did the hunting and gathering and the horticulture to feed the people with the baskets. So we know so little about all that stuff. Very little. All we can do is describe what we see and then make guesses about it, because none of those earthworks came with any instructions.
Probably my last question.
It's okay.
Can we get to the octagon, or it's on private property?
It's been a golf course for 100 years, but they're in court now breaking that lease agreement at the Supreme Court in Ohio, and I think it's going to become a public park. You can go up there now. I've been there.
Yeah, well, and
I've never asked for permission, but I've apologized a couple times.
you could overlook, but you didn't really feel it like you would if you could get in there.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And
Yes.
There is a visitor center.
Looking at the can of beer up there, and you can take does this have anything to do with the Eclipse Town today?
Does that have anything to do with what?
Eclipse Town.
The town, Eclipse with the company store? No, because this is the Shallow Brewing Company. The only brewing company that I know of that we had in Athens County was the Hawking Brewery in Nelsonville.
Right, but how did they come, is the name for the town, Eclipse Town, they didn't have some...
The town was called Hawking.
Hot.
The mine was called, it was the Eclipse Mine outside the village, or outside of the company town that was called Hawking. Yeah, but it got,
And then the mine was the mine?
the mine was a little further out River Road across the 4-lane from the Messenger. It may, matter of fact, it may have spread all around that whole area. I don't know all the details on that, but it was the mine that was called Eclipse, and the town was called Hawking. But, a lot of people think that the lakes up at the asylum were shaped like hearts, clubs, diamonds, and spades. How many of you heard that? Well, you can look at all the aerial photos that ever were made of it. None of them are shaped like that. But there is one photograph where one of the islands looks like it's got a couple of sides to it that might be a club. But it turned into an urban legend here, and more people have heard that than anything else about it. There's 2 things people know about the asylum. It's haunted. You can be in California and know about it. Oh yeah, I know about the asylum. It's haunted, and there's a stain. And of course that reinforces the hauntedness. And that's sad, because the real story of the asylum is so, the truth of it is so much far more amazing than that urban legend stuff. And that poor lady, in all these years, we haven't done anything to restore her humanity to her. I think we have an obligation as a community, as a university, to do that. She's an example of maybe some of the darkest reaches the mind can take a person, to, take their own life or something like that. And so,
What
to
poor
just be
lady?
known as a
Is
stain
she a
is a sad
ghost
thing.
or something?
Yeah, what poor lady?
Huh?
What poor lady? I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, you don't know that story? Well, a woman died up there and she was not found for something like 4 months, so her body started to decompose and on a concrete floor on the 4th floor of one of the buildings, and it left a stain. And boy, that bothered them so much. They spent so much effort trying to scrub it away and using chemicals and everything. And for years you could see the brush strokes for years, but all that's faded away, but the stain of her body is still there. And that's because, when you're decomposed, it was in front of these big windows. I know this doesn't have anything to do with eclipses. It kind of does, because she's in front of these giant bay windows, so every day the sun came up, went across the sky, and it shined, and it left a sort of a negative shadow of her on the floor. Plus, as you decompose, the biological fluids would seep into, it's amazing, on the 4th story, there's a concrete floor there. And so these fluids would seep into that concrete, so they're not going to scrub it off, it's embedded in there. So anyway, a woman died. It's been investigated. It's pretty well thought that she chose to go out that way. Yeah. You can Google it. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming out today. Watch the internet.